So welcome everyone to this session of the Just Transition platform on Peatlands. So we have four excellent guests for you today, and I'll introduce them shortly. But let me start briefly by introducing myself. So I'm Paul Spate. I'm head of unit in DG Environment. My unit is one of the units that is trying to work on working with our colleagues on using the Just Transition Fund and other similar types of financing to try some new approaches to peatlands and other some of the other environmental issues. But I think today's session is really interesting because I think it's the first time that we've had the opportunity to really talk about peatlands and about what we can do with them. And I think it's really a key challenge. If you think about some of the two major environmental challenges that we're currently facing, so biodiversity and climate protections, peatland is really at the heart of those two. How we can better tackle as really a great deal of potential to improve the situation. Just to kind of briefly set the scene, I think what you will see today is four approaches to try and manage things a bit better, and in fact a little bit by accident, all of them have benefited from the LIFE programme. And as you may have seen in the press recently, it's the 30th anniversary of the LIFE Nature and of the Habitats Directive. And over the years, there's been a number of restoration projects, and there's a good deal of experience. And some of that experience will be set out for you today. As I mentioned, peatlands also play a crucial role in EU climate policy. If you look at the latest IPCC reports, talking about the contribution of ecosystem restoration and peatlands in particular, both to climate change mitigation and adaptation. There's also a very interesting discussion to be had around the role of farming on peatlands. If you look at the Common Agricultural Policy, you have the so-called the GAIEC 2, which is an appropriate protection of wetland and peatlands. Yeah, it's called protection of carbon-rich soils. So this is also, there are some options that can be supported with additional cap payments to do this. 3% of the EU's agricultural area is made up of these carbon-rich soils, effectively drained peatlands, and these 3% are responsible for 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the EU's agricultural sector. So it is important, and there's a real potential. And then just one last kind of brief context. Well, as you know, in DG Environment, we're also working on the nature restoration law. This is planned to be adopted soon, and obviously one of the ecosystems that we would like to restore is peatlands. So I think that will be another impulse to look at alternative solutions. And I think what we would say in DG Environment, from having heard a lot of experience, heard a range of different experts, is what we feel is that there's a real desire to change perhaps practices that have been in place sometimes for hundreds of years, to do things better. But for the moment, there's a bit of uncertainty and perhaps a lack of knowledge about what to do and how to make that work, not just environmentally, but also, socioeconomically, make it work for the communities that live on these lands, the farmers and the people that are currently making a living from turf and from peatlands. So I think this is really a good timing, perfect timing, in fact, to have a bit of a discussion about what possibilities are available, what kind of restoration can be done and how you can bring people with you. And I think that's really important. So that is what we will focus on today. So you have a panel and they will all set out some of their experiences, and then they're more than happy to, as I am as well, to answer any questions afterwards. If you want to answer questions, ask questions, the way to do it is via the chat function on Swapcards. And then we'll get that to the panel, and I'll pick some out. Otherwise, of course, I have some questions myself. So I think that's more than enough from me to start with. But I did just want to start with one kind of advertisement for another upcoming event, which my colleagues in climate currently kind of drew our attention to. And this is, there will be on the 16th of June, there'll be a session on peatlands in the Rural Pact Conference. And this is within the long-term vision of rural areas. So that, I think, is another good opportunity to discuss some of these issues, which I've kind of flagged up for you today. So I think with no further ado, we can hand over to our first speaker. So our first speaker is Leticia Yourema, who is the project coordinator of Life Multi-Peat and Life Peat Restore. So she'll really start by giving you a bit some of the overall vision, and she works at NABU, which is a big German NGO. And before that, she's worked as an environmental lawyer as well as being a project coordinator. Currently, she's mainly working on European policy in the area of peatland conservation and restoration. So, Leticia, over to you to set a bit the scene.
Hi, thank you. So yes, like you said, I'm here to talk about Life Peat Restore. If there's still a little bit of time left, I will talk about Life Multi-Peat, but I think with the 10 minutes limit, we'll focus more on Life Peat Restore because that is the project that has just ended. So we have a lot more conclusions and insights to draw from. Next slide, please. So before I start, I always like to remind ourselves why we work with peatlands. So again, kind of following up on what Paul already mentioned, peatlands have grown a lot in recognition, but there's definitely a momentum that we're feeling because they are essential if we want to reach the goals that we have set in the Paris Agreement. This is because they have this unique capacity. When they are drained for forestry or agriculture or peat extraction, they become a monster level carbon source. And you can see here that degraded peatlands only occupy 0.3% of the terrestrial surface. And that small piece of land is responsible for 5 to 7% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's pretty clear we can't ignore peatlands, and if we want to reach our goals and fight against climate change, we have to include peatlands in the strategy. Okay, next slide, please. So before I go into the challenges and what we learned, I just want to very briefly go over who Life Peat Restore is. So NABU was coordinating 8 other partners. We restored 11 sites, a sum of 5,300 hectares of degraded peatlands. But in addition to this, we did a lot of data collection and monitoring throughout the project, as well as organize a lot of events and produce different materials to raise awareness to the peatlands' role in climate change mitigation, as well as to exchange experience and collaborate with other peatland stakeholders. Next slide, please. So before restoration can really start, there's always the planning stage, and this can take years. Actually, we have to jump through a lot of hoops to get all of the approvals and permits, to collect a lot of data, to get the technical design in the best way possible, to get most effective rewetting results possible. But there's a lot of resources that go into this planning stage, and it's only next slide. It's only once all of that we get all of the approvals and all of the permits, all of the consent from the neighboring land, is that we can start with the restoration. The restoration measures are usually quite straightforward. Technically, it's trench backfilling and dam construction. In some cases, when the area is forested, when it shouldn't be, when there are tree species that do not belong there, we have to remove the woody plants. The main challenges in this that I see is local acceptance from stakeholders, not only the local authorities that sometimes can be resistant to this, but also local residents. There is a fear of flooding impacts in the neighboring lands. Usually tree removal without understanding why it's necessary for peatland recovery is also not well perceived. So those are the main challenges that I would mention in this phase, as well as the overall planning and approval procedure, which has always a an element of uncertainty with the local authorities that are responsible for giving the approvals, as well as getting consent of all the landowners. Next slide, please. So it's not a lot of time, but I picked some of the sites that I think illustrate well some of the challenges that we faced. In Lithuania, our partners, Lithuanian Fund for Nature, they worked on 5 sites. One of them required very close collaboration with the state forestry department. They had to remove over 200 hectares of trees. And usually the state forestry department, they have very different aims. They want to grow trees. Unfortunately, if it's on drained peatland, that's not the best way to go about it, but that's what they know. So it's very important to work closely with them and introduce new concepts and why peatlands sometimes require removal of biomass. On the other hand, there was another site they worked on, which was very heavily degraded. The peat extraction company took everything away and it was left only with bare peat. These sites require much more proactive kind of restoration. There was a lot of sphagnum spreading. We had to build a water reservoir, set up a solar system, pumping to keep the water balance. And even despite all of that investment in terms of time and energy and money, if you have bad luck with climate, with weather conditions, the results, the desired results are not guaranteed. And in our case, it was not. The next year, we had to go back there, our partners, and do it all over again, spread all the sphagnum, and let's hope that the results will be better this time. But this is just something to bear in mind, because this is going to get worse in the future. This is going, with climate change, the weather conditions will be even more unpredictable and more extreme. So the results of restoration will not always be guaranteed, especially on heavily degraded sites. Next slide, please. In the next slide, I wanted to highlight in Estonia a different kind of challenge that we had there. Our partners, Tallinn University, they restored the largest site in our project. It's 3,300 hectares of degraded peatlands. And there, one of the interesting challenges that they faced was that there was one ditch that was so large that it started to be used by a protected fish species to reach their spawning area. So our partners had, there's a lot of delay in implementing this restoration, because in the technical design phase that we had to negotiate for long periods of time with the local authority to get the plan approved and find a compromise. So we couldn't re-wet completely as desired for the habitat, because we needed to leave that ditch open enough so that the fish could still access it. So we had to find a compromise, and that's just life. That's how it is. Next slide, please. The next slide, I don't know how I'm doing with time, so I was thinking of skipping it. Here is just to say this is another example of a heavily degraded site. A peat extraction company took everything away and then covered it with water, a very shallow water. So here our partners, Klub Przeropnikow in Poland, they had to come up with a creative, innovative system of building these floating islands. This was very expensive, very bureaucratic to get the approvals. But in the end, it is getting the desired results. We already have evidence of protected bird species coming back to this area and actually using these floating islands. But here I just wanted to show that it can be very complicated and very resource intensive to restore heavily degraded sites, and the results is not always guaranteed. Next slide, please. So in terms of main project outcomes, of course, we restored a lot of degraded peatlands, and that has led to an estimated 30% reduction of carbon emissions, according to the techniques that we used with the direct chamber measurements, as well as the indirect guess method that we used. That's the number that we've reached. But here I really want to highlight the impact on stakeholders, how these projects, through these projects, we need to collaborate very closely with different peatland stakeholders. And I believe we have an impact on them. We kind of can introduce new concepts and new ideas, and that's how we can start the seed of change, and put it that way. The other thing is that as a result of collaborating with other peatland projects, we organized this very interesting roundtable discussion with the peat industry. And here I found that it was really interesting. One of the conclusions that I found was that the just transition fund has a key role to support that transition from a peat business to a restoration business in a peat alternatives business. The impression that we got was that the business as usual will continue unless we support them to change. That is especially important in Baltic countries which have still a lot of very healthy peatland. So there's a lot to exploit, and we need to give them incentive and support them to make the change. This will not happen naturally, and it will not happen just at a voluntary basis. That was one of the key outcomes from that discussion. But you can visit our project website, and we have the recording of that discussion. Next slide, please. And then this is just an overview of the challenges that I have already mentioned. The one, since there's not a lot of time, I feel like I'm already speaking thousands of words per minute. I just wanted to highlight here the policy challenge, which is to motivate farmers and private landowners to change their behavior. So in all of our 11 sites, they were all protected sites somehow, or either Natura 2000 sites. But the real challenge is to go beyond that. It's to reach the private landowners. They can't assume the risk alone of changing the behavior, of learning a new technique, how to work on re-wetted sites that they have never worked before. And this also requires new expensive machinery. So it's a great investment with a great risk, uncertain result, and it's unfair to put it all up to them. So that's again where the Just Transition Fund really needs to play a role to support that kind of change. Next slide, please. So in terms of lessons learned, it's all, again, not a lot of time. I just want to say that we took over 5 years to restore over 5,000 hectares of degraded peatlands. But we need to, if we want to become carbon neutral by 2050, we need to restore a lot more. So according to estimates, that's around 15 million hectares in the EU until 2050. So clearly, peatland restoration has to be mainstreamed. It has to become easier from a legal perspective, the legal framework to make it easier. Sometimes at the moment in most legislation, it's easier to either make a new drainage system or maintain them. Undoing these systems, that's much more bureaucratic, expensive, and difficult. So that has to be changed. So it's not only a financial matter. We can't only throw money at it. We really need to address the legal framework for peatland restoration. It has to be made more mainstream, more streamlined. So that's basically it for Life Peat Restore. If I still have a few seconds, I would then introduce Life, which I view, this project we have just started a few months ago. And it's basically the slide is not changing, just, yeah. And it's basically we try to take up the lessons learned from Life Peat Restore and build on that for Life Multi-Peat. So that means that we are working with farmers. In this project, we want to introduce paludiculture solutions to farmers, as well as explore carbon credits, so ways to motivate farmers to change their behavior. Carbon farming is a great potential. It's a great way to provide that financial support. So we want to explore that. As well, we will be developing a EU-wide toolkit through a lot of collaboration with a lot of peatland stakeholders throughout Europe to try to improve the evidence-based policy, make everything a bit more easy and streamlined. So that's as far as I would go talking about Life Multi-Peat. I think I already went over my 10 minutes. I was kind of obsessed with that. That was one of the greatest challenge, to keep all of what we've learned under 10 minutes. That's really a big challenge. But yeah, next slide. Just thank you. Looking forward to the questions.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Leticia. That was excellent, and I think it's really gives us a good feel of some of the challenges and some of the perspectives, and how important this work is. So I think that's a great start to our discussion, and I'm sure there will be time later to go back a bit deeper into those issues for the questions. So now we're going to go to, I think, what's a really a fascinating challenge. Ireland is a rich history around peat, and a really interesting policy challenge. And John McNamara is our next speaker, and he will explain some of the issues, some of what they've come across, and what they're trying to do. John is the Corporate Sustainability Lead at Bord na Móna, which is the Irish agency managing the peatlands. And he's developing the new and implements their new sustainability strategy. And John has over 2 decades of experience in the energy and environmental sector, in particular having worked on renewable electricity and resource recovery. So over to you, John. Let's hear a little bit more in detail about the challenges in one particular member state, and in this case, Ireland.
Thank you very much. I suppose, first of all, just maybe a clarification. It's probably true, wouldn't be true to say that we're responsible for the management. I think a lot of people might take exception with that. To Leticia's point, we would have been one of the private companies, albeit state-owned, but still a commercial entity, that would have been harvesting or extracting peat from the peatlands. So I think that full disclosure needs to be brought out there before I continue. But that actually, just having seen the first presentation, there is considerable overlap both on the technical work that we've been trying to do on some of the degraded peatlands, because that's really would have been the peatlands that we are engaged with. I should add, in the project, we do work with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which is the agency responsible for peatlands in the state, on some of the Natura and designated bogs as well. So they'd have different challenges based on their past history. So I suppose with that sort of scene setting, I'll continue in that mode. If I could, to the next slide, please. First slide. So peatlands cover approximately 16% of Ireland's landmass, and Bord na Móna was established in 1946, and the timing is important. It was after the war, and Irish foreign policy was at the time the polar opposite to what it is today, where policy was to be a closed economy and self-sufficient and shun the rest of the world effectively. And that led to the establishment of Bord na Móna to harness the energy content of peat from the peatlands. That initiated a large-scale drainage of the bogs to dry them out, to allow that peat to be harvested. So you'd have seen from the late 1940s through the 1950s. Next slide, please. The development of the peatlands, primarily for electricity, to generation of electricity. And again, a rather stark fact, in 1946, not a million years ago, 2 out of every 3 homes didn't have electricity. So there was a massive rural electrification process. Again, next slide, please. The importance of peat in meeting that electrical demand would have been, at times, upwards of 40% of the power generated would have come from peat. Now, that began to drop off as electrical demand began to grow over the decades, but even into the early 1990s, it was still 15%. Probably 2017 was the last. 2018 would have seen peat at maybe 7%, and as of we've ceased peat harvesting. Some remaining stocks are there, but probably next year peat generation or peat fuel generation in the energy mix will tend to zero by certainly the end of 2023. So if I could, next slide, please. sort of focusing in on that, a lot of our plants would have been in the Midlands where the peat resources were, but also on the peripheries in the north, in Donegal, in the west in Mayo, and in the south Kerry, but usually rural areas and away from the less developed industrial centres on the coasts, which I suppose ties into the reason we're sort of presenting at this particular this particular forum. If I could, next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. This was our sort of production, our million tons of peat per annum, so the annual production profile. You see the variation, which is a function of the Irish summer, so better production yields, as it were, in the day when you had a dry summer and then wet summers. But you can see going along an average. Back in 2018, there was still an orderly exit from peat out to maybe 2025, 2027 would have been the plan A, and plan B would have been being very frank about extending that out past 2030. However, through a myriad of different policy initiatives, our own strategic review, it was decided we just make a decision to exit peat, and peat harvesting stopped in 2020, 2021. So what we find then is, we as a company were at a crossroads. We developed into a sort of climate solutions company. And I suppose if I could, on the next slide, it brings us back to the more recent history of where we are. Sorry, yep, next slide. We're back, I think, in 2018 and next slide, please. Excuse me. In 2018, we presented I think it was the second initiative for coal regions in transition in November 18, and we explained, along with some colleagues in the lignite regions, about peat, the importance of peat in the energy mix. And we saw, I think, from that, with good work from the Commission and some of your colleagues, some officials in the Irish government, we saw the expansion take in peat, lignite and oil shale into the platform. And I suppose in parallel with that, we had the Integrated Life Project, Peoples and Peatlands, that I'm going to refer to in a moment, but also our own initiative with the state and the Recovery and Resilience Fund regarding the Enhanced Decommissioning and Rehabilitation Restoration Scheme for the industrial peatlands specifically. So I suppose what I want to talk about is specifically just on peatlands rehabilitation, while here we're talking within the framework of the Peatlands and Peatlands and People, too many P's, framework within the Integrated Life Project. But it's important to say a lot of this work is building on the work that was under the EDRA scheme there from the Commission, and some previous research and projects that Bord na Móna were involved in. So if I could, on the next slide, please. The Peoples and Peatland project has 3 discrete legs. As I said, in parallel, we have the EDRIS project as well. The legs are the Peatlands Excellence, Centre of Excellence, which is effectively Peatlands Rehabilitation and Restoration, the Just Transition Accelerator, and a Discovery Visitor Experience. I'm not going to really have time to talk about them today. We're here talking about peatlands, so specifically addressing some of the works that we're doing. And again, there'll be echoes of the first presentation and some of the challenges that we've encountered. So if I could, next slide. So one of the first challenges, and probably took us by surprise when we were doing the initial budgets, was the amount of planning and design and the amount of time, resources, expertise that was required to deliver those proposed improvements in the park. That really got, we initially thought it was going to be the resources to do the works on the peatlands, but we found that the planning and design, and particularly this feeds into a point, and another point, I was smiling when the presentation was being made, that is critical for the buy-in of the neighbours that don't necessarily want to have their lands at this moment in time part of a managed rewetting scheme. And that's critical. And I'll come back to that in a moment. If you could, on the next slide, please. Yeah. Next slide. Thank you. Sorry. This is just an example of one particular bog where, oh, sorry. So let me go back. Sorry. Yeah, this is one particular bog where we go from, the original map. All this is to find out the optimum type of interventions, be it from drain blocking, be it from bunding, be it from different cell generation, LiDAR mapping, hydrology mapping, and then planning out what those works are going to be and keeping them within budget as well. Okay, so that's just a flavor, and there's months of work involved there. And there's also a very important parcel of work of disseminating that level of scientific and technical detail out to stakeholders who aren't engineers, who aren't hydrologists, who just want to know what impact is this going to have in their immediate vicinity. So I think that's one of our early lessons that I'd like to disseminate through this forum. If I could, next slide, please. Next one was staff training and retraining. As I said, we would have, for the past 70 years as an organization, been responsible for peat harvesting. We had a lot of operatives trained to go out onto the bog and harvest peat. We essentially wanted to turn that on its head. As I said, we've been in that region, in the Midlands in particular, for 3-4 generations of employees and staff would have worked with Board Namona, while we had upwards of 800 people. Some people were leaving the organisation, come to a stage of their life where they were happy at the end of peat harvesting to move on. But we did essentially retrain up to 300 people to take part in the staff training and retraining. So if I could, next slide, please. And what we see is this is probably summer 18, summer 19, where you had the operative sort of harvesting the peat, putting it into the piles for delivery to the power stations. And it's very difficult, but I can't move a cursor here. But in the middle of the second photograph, which is summer 2021, you can see diggers and excavators there working on building the bundings on that same said bog. So that's and it's a different skill from driving a tractor to driving some of those diggers and excavators, and a lot of training was involved in that there. Again, this is a function of the type of peatlands, these degraded peatlands, relative to, say, some of the other ones that the MPWS are working on as well, where the need for restoration is from a different root cause. If I could, next slide. So monitoring and data analysis, critical. Okay, one of the things we said, as I said, the EDRA scheme and the Peatlands and People scheme are running in parallel, generate a huge amount of data across different disciplines and timescales. I think timescales are important as well. And as a scientist, albeit not a peatland scientist, adamant that we would start to gather data, quality data around the work that we're doing, as much to be able to, I suppose, justify and verify any disclosures around potential greenhouse gas savings and the like, and to get more accurate data. Because what we do find is, and I'm not as au fait in other European countries, but there's a vast array of different types of peatlands with different greenhouse gas potentials, very, very close to each other, even in the Irish context. So if I could, on the next slide, please, where again we have the obvious, and I spelled atmospheric there. We have the eddy covariance towers and the static chambers, sort of traditional, but also a lot on the piezo's in there, monitoring the depth of water and how close we are. And it's a very good, this is what I mean by the different timescales. So we have the atmospheric modeling quietly going out and explaining what's going to happen to the carbon balance that we see on the sites. But in the shorter term, and notwithstanding, we do have sort of fugitive carbon emissions via water, but more importantly, by measuring the water level, seeing the progress across as the interventions develop. So I tried to color code these here. So we see red before we started to do the managed rewetting. We have the yellow, and we're beginning to get there. And the 0 line is just above the centimeter sign there in the on the legend on the vertical axis. And then you see sort of water levels stabilizing. So they're from samples around about to give us an indication that we're doing the right thing. And that's, again, another important part around the data monitoring. It's not just the long-term carbon. We also have, obviously, biodiversity monitoring going on and other sort of silt deposit monitoring and things like that going on as well. So a lot of work on the data, and you can never have enough data, not with the computing power you have today. Just keep gathering data. Okay, next slide, please. Finally, one of the aspects that's just want to bring home here, and it shows you how, like life, the life projects can't be looked in isolation or looked at one thing in particular. We developed our life project around the Climate Action Plan, the Irish Climate Action Plan. And obviously, indigenous energy and renewable energy is a critical aspect of Ireland's transition in terms of decarbonising the economy. And what we find is that, we have to be cognizant of other societal needs as well as peatlands restoration and the biodiversity. And what we're finding is the ability to co-locate renewable infrastructure on the peatlands. I think you can see over my shoulder there, there's a picture of a turbine on a rehabilitated bog. So if I could, next slide, please. What we see here is the potential for sort of win-win in terms of peatlands rehabilitation and the delivery of renewable infrastructure coexisting and occupying a footprint of probably 2 to 3% of the land bank for a given peatland there. So I suppose that's one of the other aspects that we're sort of saying here. This can do both. I was actually on the bog, one of the Mount Lucas sites, not that particular wind farm, another wind farm that's just gone under rehabilitation, with 2 ecologists yesterday who were, talking about certain bird species that were found there that hadn't been found in wind farms before. Now, there are species that certainly don't like wind farms, that's acknowledged, but it's just finding the balance and finding the co-location to give potential win-wins. So I think look forward to maybe answering some questions at the end, and thanks for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I thought it was really interesting. You really sort of fascinating history. You really, turned the whole purpose of the organisation round. So it's really, and in quite a short period of time. So I think it's a really interesting example of what can be done when things are clear and a clear direction is set. So and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those aspects later. I thought it's very interesting. We're talking about win-wins in particular. Be good to come back to that. So now I would like to come to our next speaker. So the next speaker is Andris Sirovs, who is the Deputy Director General of the Nature Conservation Agency of Latvia. And he's been working there since 2011 and is by training a biologist and also a lawyer as well. So Andris, I'll hand you the floor.
Thank you, Paul, for introducing me, and good afternoon to everybody. Yes, I will give a short presentation about our experience in Latvia. We have developed some tool how we can plan sustainable and responsible management of degraded peatlands in Latvia. Next slide, please. And our experience will be based on the LIFE project. The full name of this project is Sustainable and Responsible Management and Reuse of Degraded Peatlands in Latvia, but mostly we're using this acronym LIFE Restore project. My agency, Nature Conservation Agency, was leading partner in this project, and as you can see, the total budget was close to €2 million for this project, and we started the project in September 2015. And we ended the project in August 2019. And I will stress out that it was the first project in Latvia in this LIFE climate change mitigation adaptation program It means we get first expressions of first experience on that financing tool. Next slide, please. The main target for this restore project was to develop the tool for planning the future use of degraded peatland by taking into consideration three main aspects: the restoration of biodiversity, the economic potential, and greenhouse gases emission reductions to mitigate, of course, the long-term effects of climate change. Next slide, please. And here is a little bit detailed objectives of the project. As you can see, the first thing what we did was that we made an inventory and developed a database of degraded peatland in Latvia. Secondly, we appropriate a field measurement based methodology for accounting greenhouse gases emissions in Latvia, of course, following IPCC guidelines. Third objective was to develop a decision support tool for decision makers. What was the main target actually for this project, this tool. And we support the policy makers with best information, best data available during this project to integrate these methodologies in national peat strategy and other documents. Next slide, please. So about key challenges based on our experience in this project, I can point out several challenges. Firstly, quite challenging was to provide actually improved data for accounting system for greenhouse gas emissions in Latvia. Secondly, we really did this work in the nature by measuring greenhouse gases emissions in peatlands across different places in Latvia and in different land use of places. Then it was challenging also to develop and appropriate these recommendations for sustainable management of degraded peatlands. Cooperation between Nature Conservation Agency, between experts, between stakeholders, all kind of discussions and so also was challenging, and I will tell about later how we deal it. And for us, it was very interesting also to integrate the ecosystem services approach in management plans for protected territories. It was done first time in Latvia, and it was also quite a good experience for us. Next slide, please. So about improved data for accounting greenhouse gases emissions from managed wetlands. As you can see, we really did it in 41 places in Latvia, covering 13 different land uses. And we made this sampling of greenhouse gases for a 2 years period. And we chose such kind of land use territories like an active peat extraction site, abundant peat extraction site, in different croplands, in 2 types of forests, pine forest and birch forest, in Reisdeburg, in transitional mire, in plantations of berries. In our case, there was blueberries and cranberries, and also in bare or abundant peat extraction without vegetation. So this was territories when we made these greenhouse gases sampling and measurements. Next slide, please. So just a picture how it looks how to get these samples of emissions from the soil. We use such kind of air chambers, and as you can see, we get more than 19,000 samples of greenhouse gases, and of course these samples were analyzed in laboratories afterwards. Next slide. About recommendations for sustainable management of degraded peatlands, we developed this tool, and it was based on 4 main pillars. It was, of course, on a Latvia case. It was based on inventory data about the degraded peatlands in Latvia. It was based on data from greenhouse gases emission measurements, as I told before. It was based also on ecosystem services, about these ecosystem services which provide these territories. And it was based on possible after-use types which are suitable for degraded peatlands. And here you can see the listed, in our case, what kind of these types of future use of degraded peatlands we defined in our project. One possibility is to go to renaturalization. Other ways is cultivation of polyculture plants or cultivation of agricultural crops. Also, it's possible to cultivation of grasslands, afforestation, establishment of water bodies, or cultivation of berries. In our case, we think about large cranberries or high bush blackberries. Next slide, please. And also one of the target of the project was to approbate different kind of future use of degraded peatlands, and we made some experiments. We made some renaturalization in Kemera National Park in Kemerenbair by planting of sphagnum moss. This also was mentioned in previous presentation. It is quite interesting to plant such kind of plants in degraded peatlands. In Kaigulmaier, we planted high bush blackberry plantations. You can see it was more than 4 hectares. In other place in the same territory in Kaigulmaier, we made afforestation, close to 10 hectares. In Laugamaier, which is nature protected territory, we made some activities towards the renaturalization or rebetting of this territory, and the area covered by this action was more than 300 hectares. And in Kaudzīšumaier, we planted large cranberry plantations. Altogether, we covered by our project activities more than 320 hectares in different methods of reuse or repurposing the degraded peatlands. Next slide, please. So just some pictures. You can see the planting of sphagnum in Kemera National Park, in picture bottom, up and right, and down is a picture from this restoration works in Laugamaier in protected territory by building dams and making other activities for restoring this hydrological regime in the territory. Next slide, please. And of course, cooperation between stakeholders is very challenging and an important thing. And I think our project was very beneficiary for that we invited the most important stakeholders in our project. It means these project partners were in charge, were responsible for reaching the project main tasks. And as I said, the leading partner was Nature Conservation Agency, but we also invited Latvian Peat Association. They represent peat extraction and peat production entrepreneurs. We invited NGO, Association Baltic Coasts. They provided all kinds of expertise and developed tools for decision making. And also the scientists were involved in our project. It was Latvian State Forest Institute, Silava, and they made all this scientific work with collection of greenhouse gases measurements and samples, and also for analyzing them in laboratory after that. Next slide, please. So more important outcomes from this project was that we discovered actually that in Latvia we have about 18,000 hectares abundant degraded peatlands with no management activities in Latvia. And I think mainly these recommendations from this project will be targeted to restore or to reuse these territories in future in Latvia in these 18,000 hectares. It was quite interesting that the measured soil carbon emissions is up to 2 times smaller than it is provided in IPCC guidelines, but methane emissions shows opposite trend. It means it is possibility to develop our national guidelines how to measure and how to take into account these greenhouse gases in Latvia. We discovered that the worst land use scenario for degraded peatlands are cultivation of croplands, because there is a very less economic benefit, less nature conservation benefit, and even less effect on climate change mitigation. But on the other hand, afforestation and berry cultivation is a very good potential to reduce greenhouse gases emissions and even become to the carbon sink if these territories, of course, is managed properly. And finally, our results from our project was introduced in Latvian peat strategy, and then it was very good that it gives some methodology how to use these degraded peatlands in the future as recommendations. So next slide, please. And yes, of course, more information about this project is possible to find in website, but I will point out this book, project books about sustainable and responsible after use of peat extraction areas. This book is available in English, and it includes all our findings, all our arguments about one or other possible use of degraded peatlands, and there is some economic aspects, of course, the nature conservation aspects, and also possible use of degraded peatlands and managing these territories and possible impact on this climate change mitigation. So next slide, please. Yeah, it's my last slide. So looks Kemēr National Park, very natural and very nice raised bog. And I can just add that in Latvia we have more than 20 years history or expertise in restoring different kind of degraded bogs, raised bogs, other peatlands. And yes, of course, experience we have on place, methodology we have on place, and it's just to way to use it and to spread this information. So thank you for attention. That was the experience from Latvian side.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andris. That was very interesting. In particular, I particularly like the section where you compared some of the possible uses, the berry growing and renaturalization, and you looked to some of the pros and cons. I think that's some of the questions that some of the other member states are also asking themselves. So I'm sure we can probably come back to that later, and some of the benefits environmentally, economically, and socially, and of those different experiences. But what I would like to do next now is to turn to our last speaker. Our last speaker is Erika Tapio, and she is a project manager at Parks and Wildlife Finland. And by training, so she's an environmentalist and an ecologist, and she's been working on this hydrology life project, and in general has worked in nature conservation and with environmental issues for 15 years now. Okay, so Erika, I'd like to hand the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Arctic Circle. Yeah, so I'm working currently in the Hydrology Life project, which has been running since 2017, and we have still few years to go. Can we get next slide, please? And actually one more. So to start off, I would like to introduce a little bit what's the situation where we are at the moment with the peatlands in Finland. As you all probably know, we have a lot of them, but we have had decrease in the number of peatlands. So nowadays we have 8.7 million hectares, and the state if I can get the graph on. Yeah, thanks. So the state of the peatlands has also decreased. From our peatlands, less than half of them are in natural state actually anymore, and over half of them have been trained either for forestry actions or agriculture actions. And how does this seen in Finland? You can see from the next graph. So unfortunately, the situation is worst in southern part of Finland, where most of the trained peatlands are, and the areas of peatlands are very small. Here in Lapland, we have greater area of protected peatlands and also peatlands that haven't been trained for any purposes. There's also 1.2 million hectares mire on protected areas, from which over 50,000 hectares has been ditched before protecting them. And how is this seen in the nature? If I can get the next graph. So here you see some numbers from the late 17th to early 21st century. And this is showing the trend of decline of birds that are living in the mire habitats. So this is quite clear to us all that the species are in danger. And how much we can see from the next slide, what is the situation in Finland? Currently, unfortunately, we are counting that every 9th species in Finland is threatened, and the highest proportion can be found among birds and mosses. On the left side, you see the whole Finland and our mire types and the threatened species in them. And as I showed in the previous slide, the situation is worst in the southern part of Finland, especially in ridge fens, spruce mires. They are the most threatened habitat types of these mire groups. And at the level of whole Finland, we have 50 assessed mire habitat types, and 27 of those, so over half of those, were assessed as being threatened. And this is why we need to tackle also this problem in Finland. And if I can get the next slide, please. That is why we have come up with Hydrology Life project. And as mentioned earlier, lives have been running to the Europe and also in Finland since 95. And this is not our first project that is doing restoration of mires, and hopefully not the last one. And now I will shortly tell you what we are doing in our project. Next slide, please. So we are working across the country. Actually, we are doing restoration work over 100 Natura 2000 sites. So yes, Metsähallitus Parks and Wildlife Finland is working on the state-owned land mainly, but we are also doing some restoration on private lands. I am happy to do this work with almost 200 professionals across the country. And altogether, we are improving habitats in nearly 7,000 hectares. Next slide, please. So we are safeguarding the peatlands and also small water systems. And the effectivity of our project comes, in my opinion, from the cooperation. We have nearly 9 million budget, and there's 9 partners working together. I'm not going to all our partners, but there's 3 universities and also some other partners. And altogether, we have over 35 actions that we are doing. Next slide will show you shortly our project aims. So as mentioned earlier, we are improving the habitat quality, and we have chosen 11 valuable habitats that we are working on. Next, please. And all our restoration work is, of course, improving the water quality and controlling the flood risk management in the catchment areas. We are restoring 34 kilometers of streams. We are also improving small lakes by raising up the water level. And then we have chosen 4 important bird lakes that we are doing restoration. Also, we have protected few mires, altogether 150 hectares of valuable peatland. And one very important thing that has been mentioned during this session already many times is the data. And we here in Metsähallitus, we have actually this kind of monitoring network for the restored peatlands, and we have been running that nearly 15 years. And Hydrology Life is the first project where this data is collected and we actually get some results that how is the restoration working, what are the hydrological conditions on those restoration sites, and how is the vegetation changing during the years. And last but not least, as in all life projects, we are of course raising the awareness, and our subject is of course wetlands and Natura 2000 sites. Next slide, please. That was the other goals, and one of our biggest goal is of course restoring the mires, and we are doing that in over 5,200 hectares across the country. And by the end of April, 82% of our goal was achieved. And we are still this year and next year working with nearly 1,000 hectares to be restored across the land. Okay, so here is one of our sites here in north. It's Aapamire. And as the other projects also, we are doing traditional restoration. If you look in the far left, you will see that there's Aapamire with a lot of trees that doesn't belong there. So there's actually canal going through and dividing this great Aapamire. 2 winters ago, we took the first trees down, and a lot of dams were built to this long and wide canal. I think it was over 30 dams that we built there. And last year already, you can see in the far right here, the water has started to rise nicely, and actually would be nice to see how far it is going this year. But now the water is flowing and the mire is back to the unique shape. So this is part of our traditional restoration. The story is same as in earlier presentations, that this work takes a lot of planning. It also takes a lot of training and supervision of the work in the site with the contractors. And each of our site is unique, like the mires, they are all unique. So we need to little bit modify the methods to fit the purpose in each area. Besides this traditional site, we are doing something new in Finland. If I can get the next slide, please. So we are also doing this kind of rewetting where we return the water to triad protected peatlands. On the left picture, up in the picture, you actually see private forest area. And the private forest area has been trained so that the forest owner could get more out of the trees. And the water has been let not to the mire, but going around the protected mire. And this has, of course, started to affect this mire. And when the ditches has to be done again, opening the ditches, we are now redirecting the water back to the mire. And this is kind of win-win because the forest is still growing and the forest owners are happy, but we are also improving the quality of these protected peatlands. Now a little bit of the numbers. So I told you that we have been doing restoration work in Finland from early 19s. But due to the knowledge that we now have about climate change and biodiversity loss, something needs to be done better. And actually, during 2020, we have done 4 times more restoration than in the past 15 years. And how is this done? This is not done only by Life Project as us, but yeah, it's called Helmi Habitat Program. And this national-wide program aims in many things, but I'm now just pointing out the mire part of it. So we are protecting 20,000 hectares of mire and restoring 12,000 hectares of mire during the 10 years. So in Finland, we have chosen that we will step up with this restoration work. What is the what can be learned and taken to the other countries? Quite many of these things have been already mentioned during this session, but we need to utilize the knowledge-based solution. The data that every one of us has been collecting for years, we now need to somehow collect it together and make better decisions to safeguard ecosystems. And we need more projects, life funded, but also national funded programs to give tool to do this restoration work. And last slide, you can find links to learn more, so you can go see our project a little bit deeper, and also this Helmi Habitat program if you are interested. But this was all from my side, so thank you, and waiting for some questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That was also great, and I think really interesting to see indeed, this aspect of scaling up. One of the real I mean, life is always the pre-runner, but as we always say in DG Environment, it's a tiny pot of money. And so it needs to scale up afterwards with other larger pots. And I think this is why it's great to have this collaboration with things like the Just Transition and so on, to try and do that kind of a scale that you rightly mentioned, that we need to move quickly on this challenge. So we had some questions already from the audience, and I'll come to those, but don't, of course, hesitate if you have other questions. If there are things on your mind in the audience, don't hesitate to put them on the swap cards, and then they will be transmitted to us. But let's start with one question then from one of our colleagues here in the Commission, Sander Happerts, working in DG Regio. And I think this is really one of the crucial questions, which is, the point of the Just Transition is to tackle the ecological and environmental problems, climate and biodiversity in particular, but to do so in a way that respects the jobs and the economics of the local of the region. So I would be interested to have a discussion on how you find in running your projects. Have you been able to bring people whose previous business it was to cut the peat into other more sustainable jobs where they can now, work with berries or with agriculture, paludiculture, with tourism? So maybe if you could give us some first thoughts on how you've managed that transition in your projects, and kind of the social and maybe some of the economic benefits from that. So maybe I can start with Leticia, who gives us a bit the overview. I don't know if that's probably not for all your projects, but maybe you can pick out some findings from your projects, Leticia.
Yeah, I think I can speak in more broadly. I would expect that our colleague from Board Namona will be able to speak with much more authority on this. I just can say from our experience with Peat Restore is that there are possibilities. I think, as I mentioned already, the transition using the peat extraction companies to become a restoration company, following the Board Namona example, is already a great example of how this can be transitioned. But also, as we mentioned, we will need a lot of data. So there's a lot of monitoring activities. There's a lot of job opportunities that can come up there. Also, sphagnum farming to provide peat alternatives. So there's a lot there that can also be created in terms of job opportunities. Agriculture on re-wetted lands, there's a lot there. So I can only speak broadly in our project. I can't speak from experience about this kind of conversion, but just from seeing that there's a lot of opportunities, just need to be promoted and set up properly and properly supported.
Let's then come into some of the other examples. I mean, I know perhaps John, you would want to come back in. I think one, because you're your project in a way is a whole company moving sustainably. And also I'd be interested to know, because I mean, maybe you know, maybe you don't, but I know that Ireland in the National Parks and Wildlife Services, they've also worked quite a bit on trying to bring some tourism into the regions by putting on boardwalks and things like this. So maybe you can tell us a bit how that's worked, and what sort of results you've had so far.
Super. And so there's two discrete elements here. We're talking about in the peatlands rehabilitation, as I said, there training and retraining of some of our staff who would have been involved in peat harvesting, and also that would have been very important for the buy-in in the local communities, that people were able to transition. And secondly, that staff has been complemented with, as I said, the technical staff who are preparing the plans, and those plans are legion, as we all agree. So that's brought new skills into the region that mightn't have been there before. Okay, and certainly into and redeployed maybe civil engineers, upskilling their work as well, and some hydrologists we had, also our ecologists, but importantly for our operatives there who were able to retrain. And we have, as I said, upwards of 300 people involved in that project. On going hand in hand, and it's great to see how there's both sort of challenges that exist for us, and also hearing them echoed in other projects is both reassuring and interesting, and possibly frustrating as well. But in relation to the other sort of tourism options, we have been involved, and this is where it gets a little bit where you need good cooperation, because you have boundaries, okay, between our land bank, between NPWS bank. You may have different designations on the land banks. You may have private landholders in between, and all of a sudden what seems like a great idea in a map can be difficult when somebody says, well, what about insurance? Who's going to insure me if somebody's on my land, and things like that? And it gets very difficult very quickly. But we have had a lot of buy-in on that, and we also had input from local community groups, development groups who are interested in getting their amenity value out of peatlands, because particularly on the Board and Amona lands, and to a lesser extent on some of the NPWS lands, the bogs weren't really accessible. You know, in the Board and Amona sense, they were industrial workspaces that you just didn't want people to work. From a health and safety point of view, you didn't want people on those sites. And from some of the NPWS sites, there were sites of conservation, and, you know, access wouldn't have been the primary objective in terms of that conservation objective. So the planning around those is important, and, you know, getting the local involvement, getting the local authorities involved in the consenting for the planning, the funding side, and also the management side, because, you know, in some respects, and people can give testament to this, it's sometimes very easy to build something. It's maintaining it year after year becomes important, and that becomes somewhat self-fulfilling. And I suppose what we're now seeing is with greenways, and I'm not necessarily talking across peatlands, but greenways in general, we're now seeing the development of national strategies to think, oh, hold on a second, let's join these up. You know, in that organically they developed sort of locally, and now people are saying, wow, there's a critical mass coming here. So now can we go from Dublin in the east to Galway in the west, and, you know, be it a cycleway, be it a walkway, be it a boardwalk, all these things are beginning to come around, and there's some healthy competition between projects then, you know, that's coming in there. So certainly I think the tourism aspect is one that has potential. And I suppose traditionally tourists in Ireland stayed on the coast, and this is a way of bringing them into the Midlands. So that's important. And I should also add, you know, those two aspects are the other two pillars of the integrated life project here, sort of just transition. And that's been what we're really doing there, is ironically not so much using the bog, but using some of our workshops that would have serviced the equipment that went out in the bogs for incubators for businesses that are coming in and new startups and looking to expand. And then we have the Discovery Visitors Centre, which is another element there, looking to make a sort of a social and cultural catalyst, not a show me something, but rather an immersive experience in and around the peatlands that will draw people in to the stories, the lifestyle changes, what it means to be sustainable, looking at the history that we have there.
I think you can hear, you know, when you hear some of the challenges of it really, you know, when being able to walk for the first time in these areas that would have been more industrial or highly protected, reminds me of some of the forest discussions. You know, I think it's really valid points there. So maybe then to just follow on from this one, Andris, you looked at some different alternatives. Can you give us a first sort of flavour for the sort of the job creation or economic viability of some of these alternatives that you looked at?
Yes, of course. We provide different ways how to compare challenges to integrated peatlands actually, and in Latvian condition actually it's quite interesting, I think, to make this really blackberry cranberry plantations, because it's create a very good income actually. It is, we called in Latvia actually the red gold, because we produced a lot of them and then we exported it. It provides actually new working places, and then also for greenhouse gases reduction, emission reduction, it's quite good actually. And it is in our situation, it is quite good actually to have such kind of restoration works of use of degraded peatlands by plantation of blueberries and cranberries.
Yeah, that's really, as I said, I like that expression, the red gold. That's a nice one. And indeed, you know, when I think of some of the price of these things in the supermarkets, you could think indeed there would be some money to be made. I totally agree. Erika, what was your experience in Finland?
Yeah, thanks. We actually are trying to calculate the socio-economic value of the restoration work in our project at the moment. But the feedback we have got from the contractors is that some of them have been changing their mindset completely, and they are stopping to do the peat harvesting, and some of them have done a lot of investment in new machinery, and they have said that they're going to do only restoration work from now on. So that's a huge change in the contractors here in Finland too. And what comes to the tourism, we have the same experience already from decades, that yes, we can build new dockboats and this and that for the tourism, but the maintaining is a really big problem here also in Finland. So that kind of experience we have had.
Yeah, it's all about finding sometimes the long-term revenue streams to keep the things going. Yeah, I can totally identify with that. Okay, so then for the last 10 minutes of the discussion, maybe we can come to a couple of controversial points that have come up in the questions, and I think are good ones to discuss because they also come up, you know, in our discussions politically here in Brussels, and I'm sure they come up in your countries as well. So the first one is the role of afforestation. Now, I've heard different sides of this. Sometimes people will say it can be made to work. You need specific trees, specific conditions. Others simply saying that, you know, a bog, for it to be viable, needs to be wet, and therefore that's not compatible really with healthy trees. So there was a couple of mentions of afforestation in the presentation, so maybe we can start with those. So maybe Andris, you mentioned that you have been trying this. I mean, were you able to make it work without having to dry further the peat and without too much fertilizer? I mean, these are sometimes some of the common challenges. How did maybe give us your feedback?
Yes, of course. According our recommendations, actually, we found out that it is, of course, we should think about these conditions on the place. But one thing is the thickness of the peat layer which is left in the territory. And if it is more than 30 centimeters or more, it's good enough for pine or spruce or birch, for example. Also, acidity of the soil we should take into account, and actually if it is too acid, then we should make some neutralization a little bit. And about this drying system, we calculated that if in the period of the year there is 1 till 3 days overflowed the territories outside the vegetation season, but 1 or 3 days in the vegetation season overflooded this territories, it's enough. It's good for forest. It's not a very strong impact on the forest. Of course, if this overflooding is lasting for weeks, then I think we should think about other use of this territory, or then we should make some drainage system or make this water level a bit lower. But we have very certain criterion which we should take into account if you are thinking of afforestation, for example. What kind of condition for the soil, for hydrological regime are already in the place, and by taking into account these conditions, we can modulate the situation. It is good or a perspective for afforestation or not.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe Leticia, you've seen quite a lot of different projects and I imagine different approaches to this. What would be a bit your overview on afforestation, yes or no, or sometimes?
So I'm usually in favor of seeking the local solution, what makes sense for the area. But I have to say that my primary approach would always be nature-based solution. So go with nature, not against. And to go with nature is to re-wet. It's to keep the land that was originally wet, and find ways to use it as it is, and not go against it and establish all these inefficient resources to keep something that is against nature. So in general, I would really be more in favor of exploring opportunities with paludiculture. What can be grown there? What kind of species, what kind of products can be grown with a re-wetted site? That would be also the best way for the climate also, not forget. So that would be my input here.
Okay, thanks. So I shall get on with it because there are a couple more questions coming in. So one of them is about the role of the Common Agricultural Policy. And so in theory, there are some tools within the Common Agricultural Policy that could help, but sometimes it can also present obstacles as well. So maybe, I don't know, either Erika, have you got any experience of how have you tried to use the Common Agricultural Policy, or has it been an issue for you?
Thanks. Well, this is a bit out of my expertise, actually. So I'm not working with agricultural lands at all. Actually, maybe somebody else is better to answer on this questions.
This is where my throwing around the questions. Okay, who would like to come in on the Common Agricultural Policy question? Leticia.
I mean, I'm also, I am not an authority on this subject, but again, maybe I'm just being negative, but I'm always disappointed with the lack of ambitions and conviction. So they are always a bit of a step forward. Finally, paludiculture has been recognized that it is a possibility, but it's always a bit tame. It's always keeping still areas, still subsidizing agriculture on peatland. That should be, the first thing to go. So there's always, it's always not enough. There's definitely a lot of margin for improvement. And again, we don't have much time. If we really want to do this, we don't have much time, and they should be much more braver, I think. I think there's one of the participants, Katarina, that provides a great response already in the comment session.
Yes, absolutely. So, and then I should ask a question to you as well specifically, but I think so the point in the comments box was you can see it, that the point made that's about the productivity over biodiversity and soil protection, and whether the local productivity can effectively is perhaps wrongly prioritized as opposed to greater regional and global goods, basically. So let me give you as well this specific question, Leticia, if you don't mind. So she's asking, do we know how many peatlands have been restored in total so far? and how much of it is outside protected areas? I don't know whether that's a thing you have off the top of your head. And then peatland restoration in post-mining regions or on reclaimed post-mining land. And I wonder if by that, I guess she means traditional mining, not peat usage.
Yeah, unfortunately, in relation to the country or Europe, I cannot say. This is also something that I hope we will address in our new project, Life Multi-Peat, which is to gather all of the peatland data across Europe, put it in one place, a kind of one-stop shop kind of thing, so that anyone that is interested to know this kind of the information about the peatland that has been restored, the rate of degradation, peat depth, all of that would be we would be able to find it in one place. That's one thing that we are working on in Life Multi-Peat. So at the moment, I cannot say. I can only say I was impressed with Finland. So much has been degraded already, 47, 50, something like that. Germany, 95, I think it is, or 92% degraded. And definitely restoration is still a minimum. And you can see Life Peat Restore reflects that. Life Peat Restore, all of our sites are in protected areas, basically. So definitely we have to scale up a lot more than currently.
This is the big challenge, taking it out of the protected areas. And this is a little bit the aim, of course, of the nature restoration law. Is we have the Natura 2000, but it's not enough. It will never do the job. And particularly in some of our member states, it's only a small percentage of the territory. Depends where. Maybe just one last one to you, John, if you don't mind, because I was thinking about this trade-off between local and regional, and of course you're explaining that you're having to deal with the neighbours, what re-wetting might mean for them. And were you able to sort of sell to them some of the benefits, of course, cleaner water quality, this kind of thing, as well as how did you approach this aspect?
Well, first of all, it was complicated because when we kicked off some of our initial work under the EDRA scheme, we were in the throes of COVID, which meant the traditional town halls or the knocking on doors, as would have been the original model, that sort of had to be rejigged to deliver that. To be fair, I think when we got, as I said, when we put the science and the hydrology and the mapping and the engineering there and showed to people that, we can say, well, there was probably two things. The science was very important, and it just explaining and having the technical experts there on the side was there. Also getting some of the local politicians, some of the farming groups. We met with them at national level before we cascaded down to local level, and they have their environmental committees. They got a lot of what we were saying. The other part that probably did us no harm in these here is that we are here for the long run. It's not as if we're a third-party contractor who's going to come in, do the job, and disappear overnight. They know where we live, from that point. So I think from that point of view, we leveraged a little bit of our reputation and goodwill that existed towards the organisation as well. Now, I don't overplay that, but it certainly didn't do us any harm in those discussions, which was a sea change from your neighbour, because I think in the past as well, declaring a ditches to keep our ditches, there might have been some local work done as a goodwill gesture to some of the neighbours there. So that was stopping. So it was local interaction on the ground, but also the high level buy-in from some of the associations that our neighbours would be party to.
Okay, that's great, and I think that's very much the key to it is finding those sort of. This is a long-term thing. I think a little bit like forestry. It's a long-term project, and you need to go at it with with bring neighbours with you, and also thinking about the long-term social, environmental implications of the kind of options you're looking at. I thought that was a really interesting session. I think we explored quite a bit of ground in different areas geographically, different approaches, and the different contexts. I thought it was extremely useful, certainly from my point of view. But if you could, if you're listening today, please fill in the feedback survey. So this is now posted on the swap cards to click on. So please do that. And other than that, I'd like to finish by thanking really very much all of the presenters today for giving you such an interesting discussion with so many beautiful pictures and also such interesting stories and keeping very much to the time. So I'd like to thank them all for giving up their time and speaking today. I think, you know, it takes me back to my memories as a young man walking on Dartmoor, which is a very beautiful wetland in the southwest of England, and what the fantastic the bird song and everything you could hear. But at the same time, there was also a lot of people working in that environment still, and so this is this balance that we need to find. So I'd like to thank you all for listening in today, and to all the presenters for speaking. Thanks. Bye.